I want to invite Dr. Kyle Varner to come up to the stage. He's our first speaker tonight. He's going to give us a breakdown of his experience in South America, his work, and why he's speaking to you today. So please help me welcome him, Dr. Varner.
Thank you so much. So, this event is about poverty, and I'm going to talk about the consequences of poverty and why it means so much to me. But I want to tell you a little bit about who I am and how I got into South America. And the story starts in roughly 2010, and my medical school sent me to Puerto Rico. In Puerto Rico, they told me I wouldn't need to speak Spanish. I was just going to go to the hospital where everybody spoke English. That's what they told me. And I got there and nobody spoke English. So I had to learn Spanish, and I had to learn rather quickly. And so I got a tutor online. I started learning, but I have real problems with my listening skills in Spanish, because it's very hard to understand a foreign language when it's spoken, even if you know what the words mean. And in order to practice my listening skills, I needed to find speeches that were easy to understand, that were slow, that used simple vocabulary, that repeated themselves a lot so I could understand what was going on. And I found this politician from Venezuela named Hugo Chavez. And Hugo Chavez spoke slowly. He used very simple vocabulary. He repeated himself 5 to 7 times for every point that he made, so if I didn't understand the first time, it's coming back around. He was also entertaining. He used lots of vulgarity, but he was also profoundly disturbing, because the ideas he was espousing were dangerous ideas that went contrary to everything I believe about what it means to be human and what it means to be free. Because for Hugo Chavez, private property was an abomination. For Hugo Chavez, to be successful as a businessman was an abomination, or at least that was what he said in his rhetoric. And so I learned to have a really, really profound mistrust of his ideology called Chavismo. And I got more and more involved over time. I went to Miami for my final semester of medical school, and I lived in a building which was full of Venezuelan expats. And it was October and September of 2012. There was an election between Chavez and Enrique Capriles. And my neighbors were all very, very animated because they thought this is our chance to rid our country of this pestilence. And Chavez closed the consulate in Miami. So anybody in Miami who wanted to vote, and everybody in Miami wanted to vote, had to go all the way to New Orleans. So my neighbors chartered a bus so they could all go to New Orleans. I helped them organize that. I contributed to that, and I was with them when Chavez won. And it was a really, really sad night, because we knew that that meant more suffering for the people of Venezuela. And indeed it did. And analysis of that election after the fact shows that there was widespread fraud. So it's been a long time that I've been involved in Venezuela, but in the last year especially, it's become a very, very big deal. As everybody knows, President Juan Guaido was recognized by the National Assembly as the legitimate president of Venezuela, and recognized by over 50 countries, 50 free countries, and Juan Guaido has had a terrible time trying to dislodge the Maduro regime. And in the backdrop, with all this in the backdrop, I was fortunate enough to get connected with an NGO where I could go to the border of Venezuela. Obviously, as an American, I can't get into Venezuela, but I could go to the border as a doctor, and I could provide volunteer medical care. And that has been an amazing experience. It's been a life-changing experience in some good ways and in some bad ways for me. But I want to tell you a story about one of my patients. And her name was Flor. Flor was a young lady of about 25 years old, and in Caracas, Venezuela, about 6 to 8 months before she met me, she had what's called a septic abortion. That is not an abortion like you think of in the US. She had a miscarriage, and then she got an infection. And she ended up in the hospital on life support, on a mechanical ventilator. And to put somebody on a mechanical ventilator, you have to put a tube in their trachea. It's called intubation. And occasionally, as a result of intubation, somebody can develop scar tissue in their trachea that's called tracheal stenosis, and it grows, and if you don't treat that, that person will die. And so, unfortunately, while they could save her life from her immediate critical illness, she wasn't able to find anybody to treat her tracheal stenosis. And so she worsened, and her family sold every meager possession that they had, and they came to Cucuta, Colombia, looking for help, looking for opportunities to work, to get some money for help. And they came to our clinic, and Flor was in a wheelchair. Not because there was anything wrong with her legs. There was something wrong with her ability to breathe. And walking was not possible for her because she did not have the respiratory capacity for it. And so I saw her, and obviously we're a primary care clinic. We can't fix tracheal stenosis. She was on really high doses of steroids, which I really doubt were actually benefiting her, but I had to continue them because you have to continue steroids in that situation or they'll have a crisis. And I traded contact information with her and with her parents. And I said, listen, I'm going to help you find an ear, nose, and throat surgeon, otolaryngologist, and we're going to try to get this fixed, because what you need is a tracheostomy, which is a procedure where they cut a hole in the throat, put a little tube, and then you can breathe. There are other ways, in the developed world to treat tracheal stenosis, but the only realistic option there would have been a tracheostomy. And so I came back to the United States and was working in a hospital in the United States, and I was working on figuring out how to work all the mechanics of hiring an ENT doctor and getting them the money and getting the appointment set up, all these things, which is actually really quite difficult when you're dealing with somebody with no papers, they have no money, they have nothing. And then I got a call from Flor's father, and he said, she's really, really bad. She's turning blue, she's in a lot of distress. It's okay, take her to your nearest hospital emergency room. They will attend emergencies for anybody in the emergency room. And so they did, and I got a series of messages from her mother and her father that she was getting worse and worse. And finally that she had been intubated, and then that she had died. And it was just a devastating moment for me. It was a devastating moment for me, but not because I'm not used to people dying, that's part of medicine. But this was so unnecessary. This was a young lady who had her whole life in front of her, who had a curable problem. And I was trying to fix it, and I couldn't. And I mean, I got to know her family. These are suffering people who've lost everything, and now they've lost their daughter, and it haunts me. And this is a day I go to bed at night and I think about them, because these are people, these are real people, and it really hurts. And what really hurts is that they're just not alone. This isn't an isolated incident. I have another patient who came to me with neglected breast cancer, who I have tried for a couple of months to get an oncologist appointment for, and I'm not able to get it, even when I told the oncologists I would be paying. And finally, she actually went back to Venezuela because her family stayed in Colombia to work. They sent the money back so she could get an MRI. We found lytic lesions in her skull. And I'm not sure if she had begun treatment a few months ago, if those lytic lesions would be there or not, but delayed treatment results in bad outcomes. And it breaks my heart. Why is this happening? And the answer is lack of resources. The answer is poverty. Because it doesn't matter how generous your government is, and the Venezuelan dictatorship is not generous, but it doesn't matter how generous they are if there aren't any resources. There are 6 million refugees from Venezuela right now, a large number of them in Colombia, the most recent estimate over 1 million in the city of Cucuta on the border. There's no physical way to attend to all of their needs, because you've seen the complete destruction of the society by this malignant ideology called Chavismo, or by socialism. And the human suffering is horrible. I've seen measles, I've seen malaria, I've seen malnourished children, more neglected cancers than I can care to count. And it's all as a result of the economic collapse. Poverty produces death. There's no greater predictor of life expectancy than GDP. The higher the GDP, the longer people live. When you have wealth, that leads to health. And when you have political policies that destroy wealth, it leads to death. And so what I realized is that if I'm going to make any difference, any huge difference, I can make a difference for individuals. I can help one person at a time, but if I'm going to make a difference in changing this situation and putting a stop to this kind of mass atrocity, it's got to come at a political level. And that means fighting socialism as an idea and as a network of criminals. And that sounds very very odd that I say that socialism is a network of criminals, but I want to tell you guys a story, the history of socialism in Latin America, so that you understand what I mean when I say it's a network of criminals, and you understand what we're up against. And we're going to talk to 3 people from countries that have been affected by this network. So the story starts in 1989. It's like, you could say it starts with the publishing of the Communist Manifesto, or you could say it starts with Spanish colonialism. But in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. And the free world was so excited. Everybody was excited. The Soviet Union began to collapse. And Cuba lost its sponsor. And we thought, oh, this is going to lead to a free Cuba. And at the same time, it was becoming clearer and clearer that all of the guerrilla movements for Marxism throughout Latin America were failing. They were getting beaten back. You know, there was a great sense of hope and a great sense of despair on the part of the Latin American left. And so in response to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the failure of the Marxist guerrillas, all the leftist political organizations were rallied together by Fidel Castro himself, and they got together in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And they had the first meeting of what would become known as the Sao Paulo Forum, or El Foro de Sao Paulo. And the Sao Paulo Forum became an international criminal organization. They decided that because they no longer had a state sponsor for Cuba in the form of the Soviet Union, and that because they couldn't take power via guerrilla wars, they would enter politics. But they weren't going to play at politics like normal people participating in a democracy. They were going to use Cuban security. They were going to use crime. They were going to use the vast spy network that the Cubans, together with the DDR from East Germany, had developed. Keep in mind, Cuba and East Germany were like this. They were very close. In fact, Cuba even gifted an island to East Germany off the coast of Cuba. They were very close, and many of the worst people in the DDR immigrated to Cuba after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So they were going to use all of these resources, including narco-traffickers, everything they could, to take power. And then once they took power, they were going to burn the democratic routes to power so that they could perpetuate themselves into power. Initially, they were tremendously successful. Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Lula da Silva and the Workers' Party in Brazil, Michelle Bachelet in Chile, and it goes on and on. The Kirchners in Argentina, Correa in Ecuador. And this coincided, this was because of a unique economic phenomenon, which was a commodities boom, especially with oil, but with all kinds of commodities, lithium, gold, oil. The prices went through the roof. And that meant that these socialist governments had a lot of cash. And that freed them up to take their political tactic, their #1 political tactic, and put it into overdrive. What's that political tactic? It's clientelism. What clientelism is the idea that as a politician, you will pick supporters with whom you will develop a symbiotic relationship. You will give them political favors, you will give them money from the state, and in exchange they will give you political support. Hugo Chavez was a master at clientelism, and he used all that oil money, plus money he could borrow, to buy the love of so many people. This was kind of pioneered in Latin America by Eva Perón much prior to this, but they really put that into overdrive. And as a result, in Venezuela especially, they were able to destroy the democratic institutions in the country. They were able to take all the courts and make them not independent, put them under the thumb of the dictatorship. They were able to commit fraud in elections. They were able to arm paramilitary gangs in every town across Venezuela that would be loyal to the government but not officially part of the government, so they could commit crimes against humanity with alleged impunity. And similar schemes were tried in large parts of Latin America. In some places they were more successful than others. In Chile and Uruguay you had Sao Paulo Forum participants Michelle Bachelet and Pepe Mujica who couldn't do it because they had too strong of a system of rule of law. And so these countries today still are rather prosperous, although Chile is having problems. But what do we call these people? They make grand promises of equality, justice, and well-being to their communities, and then they impoverish them and they spread suffering. I call these people merchants of poverty. Ideologically, that's what they're doing. When they're selling socialism, the result is poverty. So these merchants of poverty are murderers. They're murderers directly because They have armed paramilitaries. They're murderers directly because they shoot dissidents in the street. But they're murderers indirectly because they destroy economies. And then treatable medical conditions kill people. Starvation kills people. Pandemics kill people, or epidemics, I should say, like malaria in the state of Falcon right now in Venezuela. So it's very important that we fight against these merchants of poverty and start bringing about prosperity in Latin America. The country of Chile is the model, partially, that we need to follow. Chile had a socialist autocrat in power from 1971 to 1973. His name was Salvador Allende. And Salvador Allende was deposed. It's a very controversial part of Chilean history. But when he was deposed and a new dictatorship established, but a right-wing dictatorship, the dictator brought in some economic advisors from the Chicago school. And they were called the Chicago Boys. And they took control of the economic policy in Chile. They didn't have any control over the social policy. They didn't have anything to do with the atrocities committed by Pinochet. Don't think I'm praising that. In fact, I think it's horrible. But what they were able to do was grow the Chilean economy. And in 5 years, infant mortality dropped by 50%. At the time, Chile was the poorest country in Latin America. Today, it's the wealthiest country. The wealthiest country at that time was Venezuela. Today, it's the poorest. Life expectancy among Chileans was the lowest in Latin America at the time. Now, it's the highest. Venezuela had the highest life expectancy at the time. Now, it's the lowest. And this series of events, the transformation of Chile from a country of poverty, death, and misery into a developed country that is the crown jewel of Latin America, is known as the Chilean miracle. I think there's hope for Latin America despite the tremendous threat of Cuba, of the Sao Paulo Forum, and of the leftists. And that hope starts with the Venezuelan opposition. Venezuela has an opposition leader named Maria Corina Machado, and she is an amazing woman. She's been in Venezuelan politics for 20 years. When she was a member of the Venezuelan National Assembly, she stood up to Hugo Chavez, and she told him in front of the entire country and the entire National Assembly that expropriation of private property is theft. He became very upset. Shortly thereafter, he had fake charges brought against her and kicked her out of the National Assembly. But she has a nationwide network of liberal political activists. And when I say liberal, I don't mean liberal in the sense that we think of it in the United States. I mean liberal in the sense of people who believe in free markets and individual liberty. And the amazing thing about Maria Corina is that she doesn't veer off into the authoritarianism of the far right. You know, Bolsonaro in Brazil right now is really big on free markets, and I love him for that. But he marries it to some very ugly social ideas. And as a result, he's tainting the ideas. But Maria Corina isn't. She is a reliable liberal who says that individual liberty is paramount, and it's through individual liberty, it's through democracy, and it's through respect for human rights that we raise a society out of this horrible condition. And I believe that once the Maduro dictatorship falls, Maria Corina will win the first free elections in Venezuela, and she will be the president of Venezuela. And then we will see the Venezuelan miracle. It's going to dwarf the Chilean miracle. Sadly, Argentina's on a different path. Argentina has populist left-wingers involved with the Sao Paulo Forum, Alberto Fernandez and Cristina Kirchner. They're impoverishing the country, and we're going to see something similar to a Venezuelan-style collapse. We're going to see huge problems in Argentina. But this contrast of tremendous growth and prosperity that's coming to Venezuela once the Maduro dictatorship falls, compared to the tremendous depression that Argentina is currently going through, and that's only going to get worse under Fernandez and Kirchner, this is going to show the world that liberalism can work without dictatorship and without cronyism, without any kind of clientelism. We can build a healthy democracy that respects human rights in all areas, and we can have a market economy that brings prosperity. And the contrast with the suffering in Argentina is going to make it clear once and for all that liberalism is the path forward for the continent, for the hemisphere. The United States, Canada, and Chile are currently the wealthiest countries in the hemisphere, but that wasn't always true. Argentina used to be, and we'll hear about that later tonight. But what I want to close by telling you is, you know, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights is Michelle Bachelet. She's a socialist. She's a participant in the Sao Paulo Forum, former president of Chile. And she wrote a report about Venezuela And she did her very best to whitewash the crimes of Nicolas Maduro, but she had to admit to 7,200 extrajudicial murders by his security forces at his orders. That doesn't scratch the surface, because the real depth comes from the untreated type 1 diabetics who die of diabetic ketoacidosis. It comes from the people with high blood pressure who can't get their medication and have a stroke. It comes from the kids who can't get clean water and die of diarrhea, the parasitic diseases. And that number in Venezuela, in my estimation, is clearly over 1 million. There's 1 million victims of the Sao Paulo Forum. So it's time for the entire Western Hemisphere to realize that we can no longer flirt with socialism. It's not a solution to inequality. It's not a solution to bring prosperity. It is a road to death and serfdom. And once we realize that and move forward with a clear moral vision of liberty, we can deliver prosperity, and we can deliver hope, and we can deliver well-being to literally billions of human beings. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Carlos Alfaro from Arizona Talks, and if you like conversations like these, be sure to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and at our website at arizonatalks.org.